The rain hammered against Jason Mercer's windows with unusual intensity, each drop an insistent reminder of the storm's fury. He sat at his desk, nursing a glass of whiskey while absently flipping through the pages of an astronomy magazine. At 34, his life had settled into a predictable rhythm, days spent teaching physics at the local community college, evenings alone in his isolated house on the edge of town. The solitude suited him, or at least that's what he told himself. Lightning split the sky, followed almost instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the foundations of his home. But this was different, the thunder didn't fade. Instead, it crescendoed into a roar that rattled the walls and sent his whiskey glass skittering across the desk. "What the hell?" Jason murmured, rising from his chair just as the ceiling above him groaned. Dust and plaster rained down, forcing him to shield his eyes. The impact came without warning, a tremendous crash from the roof that sent him stumbling backward. The house shuddered violently, lights flickering before plunging the room into darkness. In the sudden quiet that followed, Jason could hear only the pattering of rain and his own ragged breathing. He fumbled for his phone, activating its flashlight. The beam revealed a substantial crack running across his ceiling, water already beginning to seep through. "Perfect," he muttered, grabbing a raincoat from the hook by the door. Whatever had hit his roof, probably a fallen tree, would need immediate attention before his house became completely waterlogged. The wind nearly tore the door from his grip as he stepped outside. Rain lashed against his face as he circled the house, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. When he reached the back, he stopped abruptly, breath catching in his throat. It wasn't a tree. Embedded in his roof was what appeared to be a metallic pod, roughly the size of a small car. Steam hissed from its surface where raindrops struck superheated metal. The object had clearly fallen from a great height, its exterior scorched and dented. A faint bluish light pulsed intermittently from within. "This can't be happening," Jason whispered, even as he approached the fallen object. A crashed satellite? A piece of space debris? His scientific mind scrambled for rational explanations. The answer came when a section of the pod suddenly slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Jason stumbled backward, slipping in the mud and falling hard as a figure emerged from the opening. In the glow of his dropped flashlight, he saw her, clearly female in form but unmistakably not human. Her skin was a pale lavender hue, with subtle iridescent patterns that caught the light. Long silver-white hair clung to her face and shoulders. Her features were delicately proportioned but alien, large, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to shift between blue and violet, a narrow nose, high cheekbones, and full lips. She wore what appeared to be a flight suit of some resilient material, torn and charred in places. Most striking was her abdomen, distinctly swollen with pregnancy. She stumbled from the pod, one hand braced against its edge, the other protectively cradling her belly. Blood, darker than human blood, almost indigo, trickled from a gash on her forehead. Jason scrambled to his feet, frozen between the instinct to flee and the urge to help. The alien woman's eyes locked with his, widening in apparent recognition. She took an unsteady step toward him. "Cale," she whispered, her voice melodic despite its weakness. "Cale, is it really you?" Jason shook his head, bewildered. I'm not, my name is Jason." She reached for him, swaying dangerously. "They said you died. But I knew you would find a way back to me." Before he could respond, her knees buckled. Jason lunged forward instinctively, catching her before she hit the ground. She felt surprisingly light in his arms despite her pregnancy, her skin warm and silky against his rain-soaked hands. "Please," she murmured, looking up at him with those extraordinary eyes. "Our child, protect our child." Then she lost consciousness, her head lolling against his chest. Jason stood in the pouring rain, holding an unconscious, pregnant alien woman who had just crashed into his roof and called him by another name. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible, that he should call someone, the police, the military, someone with the authority to handle whatever this was. Instead, he found himself carrying her toward his house, careful not to jostle her injured form. Something deep in his subconscious resonated with her presence, a strange familiarity he couldn't explain. As he laid her gently on his couch, her eyelids fluttered briefly. "Valia," she whispered. "My name is Valia." That night, as Jason tended to her wounds with his limited first aid supplies, he dreamed of crystal spires rising against an amber sky, of flying through the stars in ships that responded to thought, and of a woman with lavender skin and eyes like twilight, calling him beloved in a language he somehow understood. Morning light filtered through Jason's curtains, painting golden streaks across the living room. He awoke with a start, his neck stiff from spending the night in an armchair. For a moment, he wondered if the events of the previous night had been some bizarre dream, until his eyes fell on the woman asleep on his couch. Valia's chest rose and fell in gentle rhythm, her silver-white hair splayed across the pillow he had placed beneath her head. The gash on her forehead had sealed remarkably quickly, leaving only a faint purple line. In daylight, her alien features seemed both more pronounced and strangely beautiful, the subtle luminescence of her skin, the delicate points of her ears, the graceful sweep of her brow. Jason rubbed his eyes, still struggling to accept the reality before him. He had cleaned and bandaged her injuries as best he could, terrified that her alien physiology might react poorly to human medicine. But she seemed stable, and the protective swell of her pregnancy appeared undamaged. "Kale?" Her voice, soft and melodic, startled him from his thoughts. Her eyes, impossibly deep, shifting between violet and blue, were now open and fixed on him. "I'm not," Jason began, then hesitated. "My name is Jason. Jason Mercer." Valia slowly pushed herself to a sitting position, one hand instinctively cradling her belly. "Your appearance has changed, but I would know your soul anywhere." She reached out, her slender fingers hovering just shy of touching his face. "What happened to you?" "Nothing happened to me," Jason replied gently. "I think you're confusing me with someone else. I've lived on Earth my entire life." A shadow of doubt crossed her features. "Earth?" She tested the word as if it were unfamiliar. "This is not Lyria?" "No, it's not." Jason stood, pacing nervously. "Look, your ship or pod or whatever crashed into my roof last night. You're injured, you're pregnant, and you're not from here. I should probably call someone, but I don't even know who handles alien visitors." "The Syndicate will be tracking my escape vessel," Valia said, suddenly urgent. "If you contact your authorities, they will find me, find us." Her hand reached for his, surprisingly warm and soft. "Please, Kale, Jason, you must remember something. Our home on Lyria, the rebellion, our bonding ceremony under the twin moons." Jason pulled his hand away, unsettled by the jolt of electricity that seemed to pass between them. "I'm sorry, but none of that happened to me." Yet even as he spoke, fragments of images flashed before his mind, standing in a garden of crystalline flowers that sang in the breeze, holding Valia's hands as luminous ribbons of light bound their wrists together, feeling the cool touch of strange metals as he piloted a vessel through a sea of stars. He shook his head to clear it. "I need coffee," he muttered, retreating to the kitchen. As he waited for the coffee to brew, Jason peered through the window toward his backyard. In daylight, the crashed pod was unmistakable, a sleek, oval craft partially embedded in his roof. Thankfully, his house was isolated enough that neighbors wouldn't notice, but it was only a matter of time before someone spotted it. When he returned to the living room with 2 mugs, he found Valia examining a framed photograph of himself at a university event. "Your body is different," she said softly. "But your eyes, they are the same." Jason set down the mugs. "Tell me about him, about Kale." Valia's expression softened with memory. Kale was a scientist, like you seem to be. He specialized in quantum mechanics and dimensional theory. We met when I was assigned as his security detail during the early days of the rebellion. A smile played at her lips. He was stubborn, brilliant, sometimes frustratingly logical. But his heart was boundless. As she spoke, more images flickered through Jason's mind, working in a laboratory filled with technology beyond his comprehension, arguing passionately with officials in gleaming chambers, holding Valia as explosions rocked the world around them. We were bonded for 3 cycles before the Syndicate's forces attacked our settlement, she continued, her voice growing thick with emotion. You, Kale, insisted I escape with the research data while he led them away. The last communication I received said he had been captured. Her hand trembled slightly. They reported his execution, but I never believed it. I've spent the last cycle searching. And the baby? Jason asked, gently steering the conversation. Valia's expression brightened as she placed both hands on her swollen belly. Our greatest achievement. Kale discovered a way to enhance the genetic connection between bonded pairs. Our child carries abilities that could help free our people. Jason sat beside her, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. May I? He asked, hand hovering above her abdomen. She nodded, taking his hand and placing it against the swell of her pregnancy. Beneath his palm, he felt a strong, rhythmic movement, faster than a human heartbeat. The moment their skin connected, a surge of images overwhelmed him, standing in a medical chamber, watching in awe as their child's genetic structure displayed on holographic screens, feeling the first fluttering movements against his palm, Valia's joyous laughter as they chose names together. Jason gasped, pulling back as if burned. I saw, but that's impossible. What did you see? Valia asked, hope illuminating her features. I saw us in some kind of medical lab, looking at the baby's genetics. We were excited about something in the DNA structure. Valia moved closer, her scent like exotic flowers and distant lightning. That was 3 months before the attack. The enhancements were successful. Our child carries the ability to manipulate quantum fields. It's why the Syndicate wants us so desperately. Despite his rational mind screaming objections, Jason found himself leaning toward her, drawn by an inexplicable force. None of this makes sense, he whispered. The heart remembers what the mind forgets, Valia replied, her breath warm against his face. When their lips met, it felt both shockingly new and achingly familiar. Her mouth was sweet, tasting of something like honey and stardust. Jason's hands moved of their own accord, one tangling in her silver-white hair, the other tracing the luminescent patterns on her neck. Valia's body responded with surprising urgency, her alien physiology both strange and enticing under his touch. She guided his hand beneath the torn flight suit, across the swell of her pregnancy to the softness of her breast. Her skin seemed to pulse with light wherever he touched. I've missed you, she breathed against his mouth. My love, my bonded, my Kale. As their bodies entwined on the narrow couch, Jason felt the last barriers of his doubt crumbling away. Each caress unlocked more fragments, memories of intimate nights under alien skies, of their bodies joined in passion, of the spiritual connection that transcended physical form. Later, as they lay together in the afternoon light, Jason stared at the ceiling, his world thoroughly upended. Either he was experiencing the most elaborate delusion of his life, or everything he thought he knew about himself was a carefully constructed lie. The Syndicate will have detected my crash landing, Valia murmured against his chest. They'll be coming for us soon. Jason tightened his arm around her shoulders, a protective instinct rising that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. Let them come, he said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. I won't let them take you, or our child. 3 days passed in a strange domestic harmony. Jason called in sick to the community college, claiming a severe bout of flu. The truth was far more complex, he couldn't bear to leave Valia alone, not when each hour spent with her unlocked more fragments of a life he'd supposedly forgotten. The crashed escape pod remained lodged in his roof, though Valia had helped him construct a makeshift tarp covering to protect against rain and prying eyes. Inside the house, they established a cautious routine, with Jason venturing out only for essential supplies while Valia worked to repair a small communication device salvaged from her vessel. It was during breakfast on the fourth morning that the first sign of trouble appeared. Jason's phone emitted a high-pitched whine before the screen went black. Moments later, the television flickered on by itself, displaying only static. "They're scanning," Valia said, her face tightening with concern. She set down her fork and moved to the window, peering cautiously through the blinds. "The Syndicate uses quantum resonance technology to locate specific energy signatures." "Like the one from your pod?" Jason asked, joining her at the window. "And like the one our child emanates." Valia placed a protective hand over her swollen belly. "The genetic modifications make the baby's cellular structure uniquely detectable." Jason felt a chill run through him. "How much time do we have?" "Days. Perhaps less." She turned to him, her violet blue eyes searching his face. "I need to finish repairing the communicator. There are resistance cells scattered across this galaxy. If I can reach them, they might extract us before the Syndicate arrives in force." The word "us" hung in the air between them. Despite the growing evidence of their shared past, despite the memories that continued to surface in his dreams and waking moments, despite their increasingly passionate physical connection, Jason still struggled with the implication that he might leave Earth behind. "Tell me more about them," he said instead. "About the Syndicate." Valia's expression darkened as she returned to the table. "They began as a corporate alliance on Lyria, controlling resources and eventually the government itself. When resources became scarce, they developed technology to colonize neighboring systems. Those who opposed their methods formed the resistance." As she spoke, Jason's mind filled with corresponding images, massive city ships moving between stars, weapons that could destabilize planetary cores, and faces of officials in gleaming uniforms issuing orders for planetary pacification. "Kale, you were invaluable to the resistance because your research offered alternatives to the Syndicate's destructive methods of colonization," Valia continued. "But when you discovered how to enhance genetic potential through quantum bonding, everything changed. Our child would be the first of a new generation," Jason murmured, the words rising unbidden from some buried memory. "Beings who could manipulate reality at its most fundamental level." Valia looked up sharply. "You remember?" Before Jason could respond, a harsh electronic squeal erupted from the device on the coffee table. Valia moved to it quickly, adjusting something that made the noise stop. "They're closer than I thought," she said, her voice tight. "We need to prepare." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Valia instructed Jason on how to construct simple defenses using household electronics, devices that would disrupt the Syndicate's tracking and scanning equipment. For his part, Jason was disturbed by how natural it felt to follow her directions, his hands remembering skills his mind couldn't recall learning. As evening approached, they sat side by side on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Valia had changed into clothes Jason had purchased for her, a loose dress that accommodated her pregnancy, though the material seemed to fascinate her. "Your world is beautiful," she said softly. "Primitive in technology, but the natural environment." She gestured to the forested hills surrounding his property. "On Lyria, such landscapes exist only in preservation domes now." Jason studied her profile, illuminated by the fading light. Her alien features had become dear to him in ways he couldn't articulate. "What was I like?" he asked. "As Kale, I mean." A smile played across her lips. "Passionate about your work. Stubborn when challenged. Gentle in private." She placed her hand over his. "Much as you are now. But how did I end up here, with no memory of that life? If I am Kale, how did I become Jason Mercer, Earth physics teacher with a mundane life and ordinary past? Valia's expression grew troubled. I have a theory. The Syndicate has technology that can transfer consciousness between compatible bodies. They developed it for their highest officials to extend their lives. If you were captured. She didn't finish the thought. The implication hung between them. Had his consciousness been transferred as punishment? Or had it been his own desperate attempt to escape, to find a way back to her across the stars? Before Jason could pursue this troubling line of thought, Valia suddenly gasped, doubling over. What is it? He asked, alarmed. The baby, she breathed, guiding his hand to her abdomen. Feel. Beneath his palm, Jason felt an unmistakable ripple of movement, stronger than any he'd felt before. But this time, something else accompanied the physical sensation. A presence, curious and innocent, brushed against his mind. Father? The word wasn't spoken aloud, but resonated within his consciousness like a bell tone. Did you? He began, staring at Valia in astonishment. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. The bond is forming. Our child recognizes you, despite your changed form. Overwhelmed, Jason pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers with desperate intensity. Their kiss deepened, bodies pressing together with urgency that transcended their strange circumstances. His hands traced the luminescent patterns on her skin, now familiar territory that never ceased to amaze him. They made love as the stars emerged above them, their bodies joining with a sense of rightness that defied explanation. Valia's alien physiology responded to his touch in ways both mysterious and entrancing, her skin emitting a soft glow that intensified with her pleasure, her voice calling his name, both names, in breathless abandon. Afterward, they lay together on a blanket beneath the night sky, her head resting on his chest. Tomorrow I'll finish the communicator, she murmured sleepily. We need to be ready when they come. I'll be ready, Jason promised, stroking her silver-white hair. A new certainty had settled in him, born not just from the memories that continued to surface but from a deeper knowing. Whether he was Jason or Kale or somehow both, his place was with Valia and their child. As if in answer to his thoughts, the distant stars above them seemed to pulse briefly before returning to their steady light. Something was approaching, something that would force him to choose between the life he knew and the life he was beginning to remember. And deep inside, a voice that sounded like both his own and a stranger's whispered that he had already made his choice the moment he carried Valia through his door. Dawn broke with an unnatural stillness. No birdsong greeted the rising sun, no whisper of wind disturbed the trees surrounding Jason's property. Even the air felt charged, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. Jason stood at the kitchen window, clutching a mug of coffee gone cold. He hadn't slept, his mind too full of preparations and half-remembered combat training that his body seemed to know better than his conscious mind. Beside the sink lay 3 makeshift devices Valia had helped him construct, quantum disruptors, she called them, cobbled together from household electronics and components salvaged from her crashed pod. They're here, Valia's voice came from behind him. She stood in the doorway, one hand supporting her swollen belly, the other holding the now-repaired communication device. Her silver-white hair was pulled back in a braid, and she had changed into the flight suit she'd arrived in, mended as best as possible. How do you know? Jason asked, setting down his mug. The quantum field disturbances, she replied, crossing to stand beside him. And this? She held up the communicator, its display showing a pattern of concentric circles pulsing with light. Their ships have entered your atmosphere. They're trying to be discreet, using your planet's satellites to mask their approach. Jason nodded, a strange calm settling over him. Did you reach the resistance? Yes. They received my transmission, but the nearest extraction team is stationed 3 systems away. They won't arrive for at least 12 of your Earth hours. Her eyes met his, fear and determination mingling in their depths. We need to hold the syndicate off until then. 12 hours, Jason repeated. It seemed both an eternity and no time at all. We should get the disruptors in place. They worked methodically, positioning the devices at strategic points around the property. As Jason secured the final one near the tree line, he caught a flicker of movement in the sky, something metallic reflecting the morning sun, descending slowly toward the clearing beyond his property line. They're landing, he called to Valia, who was activating the disruptor by the front porch. How many? She asked, her voice tight with tension. Jason squinted against the glare. One ship that I can see. Small, maybe a scout vessel? Standard procedure, Valia confirmed, joining him. They'll send an advance team first to confirm my presence and secure the area. Her hand slipped into his, squeezing tightly. Jason, there's something you should know before they arrive. He turned to her, struck by the urgency in her voice. If I'm captured, they'll take our child immediately after birth. The baby will be raised as a weapon, its abilities harnessed for destruction. Her voice broke slightly. I would rather die than let that happen. It won't come to that, Jason said firmly, drawing her into his arms. I won't let them take either of you. Valia pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his. You still don't fully remember who you were, who we were together. But I need you to trust what your body remembers, what your heart knows. Kale was not just a scientist. He was also a resistance commander, trained in combat as well as quantum theory. Before Jason could respond, a high-pitched whine cut through the air. The disruptor nearest the crashed pod sparked violently, then went dark. They're neutralizing our defenses, Valia said, her body tensing. We need to get inside. They barely made it to the door when the first energy pulse struck the ground where they had been standing, scorching the earth and sending up a plume of smoke. Jason pushed Valia inside, slamming the door behind them just as another blast hit the side of the house, shaking the foundation. The basement, Jason said, guiding her toward the door that led downstairs. Its reinforced concrete should provide better protection. As they descended, the sounds of destruction continued above them, crashing, splintering wood, the distinctive hum of energy weapons. Jason's hands worked automatically, securing the heavy basement door with a makeshift barricade while Valia activated their final disruptor device. This won't hold them for long, she said grimly, pressing her back against the wall. She winced suddenly, one hand flying to her abdomen. What is it? Jason asked, immediately at her side. The baby, she gasped. The stress, I think it's triggering early labor. A cold dread washed over him. Now? But the resistance extraction team won't be here for hours. Valia's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. This child has its own timing, it seems. The basement door shuddered under a heavy impact, interrupting their conversation. Dust rained down from the ceiling as something heavy moved across the floor above them. How many? Jason whispered, positioning himself between Valia and the door. Standard advance team would be 5 operatives, she replied, her voice strained as she tried to control her breathing through what was clearly a contraction. Heavily armed, neurally enhanced. The door shuddered again, the wood beginning to splinter around the hinges. Jason cast around desperately for anything that could serve as a weapon, settling on a metal pipe that had broken free from the ceiling. Stay behind me, he said, gripping the pipe tightly. Jason, Valia's voice was urgent. Remember who you are. The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and smoke. Through the haze, Jason could make out armored figures descending the stairs, humanoid in shape, but with helmets that concealed their features completely, their bodies encased in sleek black exoskeletons that pulsed with subtle blue light. Subject located, one of them announced, its voice modulated and flat. Pregnancy confirmed. Directive, secure and extract. Stay back. Jason shouted, raising the pipe. The lead operative raised a weapon, a sleek device that hummed with energy. Male subject is non-compatible. Directive, neutralize if resistant. Time seemed to slow as the operative leveled the weapon at Jason's chest. In that suspended moment, something crystallized in his mind, not just fragments of memory, but a complete neural pathway unlocking. His body moved before his conscious mind could process what was happening. He ducked and rolled, avoiding the energy blast that scorched the wall behind him. His hand found the broken piece of the disruptor device, fingers automatically reconfiguring its circuits. As he came up from the roll, he hurled the device directly at the lead operative's helmet. The resulting electromagnetic pulse dropped the first two operatives instantly, their exoskeletons shorting out with a cascade of sparks. The remaining three spread out, their movements precise and coordinated. Elevate threat assessment, one commanded. Subject displays combat training consistent with resistance protocols. Jason didn't give them time to adjust their strategy. He launched himself at the nearest operative, his body moving with a grace and precision that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. His fist connected with a vulnerable junction in the exoskeleton, and he followed through with a twisting motion that severed connections in the armor. Energy blasts scorched the air around him as he moved, ducking and weaving with preternatural awareness of his surroundings. He grabbed the disabled operative's weapon, its weight and balance immediately recognizable in his hands. Kale protocols confirmed, the lead operative announced, something like alarm finally penetrating its modulated voice. Subject identity verified. Initiate containment procedure Alpha. Too late, Jason growled, leveling the captured weapon. In two precise shots, he disabled the remaining operatives, their armored forms collapsing to the basement floor. The sudden silence was broken only by Valia's labored breathing. Jason turned to find her leaning heavily against the wall, face contorted in pain. That was definitely Kale, she managed between breaths. The way you moved. I remembered, Jason said simply, rushing to her side. Not everything, but enough. The combat training, the weapon systems. He helped ease her down to a sitting position. Are you all right? She shook her head, her skin glowing more intensely than he'd seen before. The baby is coming. Now. Jason glanced at the disabled operatives. They'll have reinforcements. The main ship can't be far behind. We can't leave, Valia gasped, gripping his hand so tightly her nails broke his skin. I can't move, not like this. Her eyes found his, desperation and trust mingling in their alien depths. You'll need to deliver our child, Kale. Despite the danger surrounding them, despite the uncertainty of what would come next, Jason felt a profound certainty settle over him. Whether he was Jason Mercer or Kale of Lyria, or somehow, impossibly, both, he knew what he had to do. I'm here, he said, kneeling beside her. I won't leave you. Either of you. Above them, the sounds of another ship approaching rumbled through the damaged house. Time was running out, but in that moment, as Valia's labor intensified and the life they had created together prepared to enter the world, nothing mattered except the miracle unfolding before him. One more push, Jason urged, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. The basement ceiling shuddered as another impact struck the house above. Dust and small fragments of concrete rained down, but he remained focused entirely on Valia. Her skin glowed with an intense luminescence that bathed the dim basement in ethereal light. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her silver-white hair plastered to her temples as she bore down with a final, powerful effort. I can see the head, Jason encouraged her. You're doing amazing. Valia's cry echoed off the basement walls as she gave one last tremendous push. In an instant, the world seemed to pause, the rumbling above, the danger pressing in from all sides, all of it receded as a new life slipped into Jason's waiting hands. The child was beautiful, unmistakably alien with skin that shimmered between lavender and opalescent hues, yet with features that reflected both parents. Tiny, pointed ears. A tuft of hair as dark as Jason's but with strands of silver woven through. And most striking of all, eyes that opened immediately, revealing irises that shifted color like a living aurora. A daughter, Jason whispered in awe, carefully wrapping the newborn in his discarded shirt. We have a daughter. The baby didn't cry. Instead, she regarded her parents with an awareness that seemed impossible for a newborn, her tiny hand reaching out to touch Jason's cheek. The moment their skin connected, a surge of pure memory crashed through him, not fragments this time, but the complete truth of his existence. He was Kale, quantum physicist and resistance commander from the world of Lyria. Captured during a mission to protect Valia and their unborn child. Subjected to the Syndicate's consciousness transfer technology as they extracted his knowledge of genetic enhancement. His mind, his soul, everything that made him who he was, had been sent across the stars in a desperate gamble to escape, landing in the body of a human teacher named Jason Mercer. And now, with his daughter's touch, the partition between his two selves dissolved completely. Lyra, he said softly, the name rising from newly restored memories. We agreed to name her Lyra. Valia's eyes filled with tears as she reached for their child. You remember. Everything, he confirmed, carefully transferring their daughter to her mother's arms. The Syndicate captured me after you escaped. They tried to extract information about the genetic modifications, but I had encoded the most critical data into my own neural patterns. They couldn't access it without destroying my consciousness entirely. The ceiling groaned ominously above them. The disabled operatives on the basement floor had begun to twitch as their systems attempted to reboot. We don't have much time, Valia said, cradling Lyra against her chest. Commander Draylock will have arrived with the main contingent by now. No sooner had she spoken than a new voice echoed through the damaged house, amplified and coldly precise. This is Commander Draylock of the Syndicate Retrieval Division. We have your location surrounded. Surrender the female subject and offspring immediately. Resistance is futile and will result in termination. Jason, now fully integrated with his Kale memories, assessed their situation with tactical precision. The advance team's ship is still at the edge of the property. If we can reach it, I can override their security protocols. Valia's expression was doubtful. Even if we get past Draylock's forces, I'm in no condition to run. You won't have to, he replied, already moving to collect items from the fallen operatives. Their combat suits have assisted movement capabilities. Working quickly, he assembled components from 2 of the disabled exoskeletons, creating a makeshift support system that he carefully fitted around Valia's exhausted body. This will help you move, he explained, adjusting the neural interface. It's not perfect, but it should hold until we reach the ship. Valia nodded, testing the support as she carefully rose to her feet, Lyra securely cradled against her with one arm. What about the Syndicate forces between us and the ship? In answer, Jason activated one of the seized energy weapons, its power cell humming to life. I'll clear a path. Stay behind me. They ascended the shattered staircase cautiously. The main floor of Jason's house was barely recognizable, walls blasted open, furniture reduced to splinters, the roof partially collapsed where Valia's pod had crashed just days before. Through a gaping hole in what had been his living room wall, Jason could see them, at least 20 Syndicate operatives in formation around a sleek command vessel that had landed in his front yard. At their center stood a tall figure in ornate black armor, distinctive from the others by the red insignia that marked his rank. Draylock, Jason murmured, memories of the commander's reputation for ruthless efficiency flooding back. Kale of Lyria, Draylock's amplified voice responded, having detected their presence. Or should I call you Jason Mercer now? An impressive adaptation, transferring your consciousness across such distance. Our scientists were disappointed when they discovered your empty body. "Stand down, Draylock," Jason called back, positioning himself to shield Valia and Lyra. "The Resistance has been notified. Extraction teams are en route." "In approximately 7 hours," Draylock replied with cold amusement. "Far too late to save you. My orders are to recover the child and terminate both parents. The Syndicate has deemed you too dangerous to recapture." Without warning, Draylock raised his hand, signaling his forces. Energy weapons powered up in unison, aimed at the house. "Last chance, Kale. Surrender the child, and I may consider allowing the mother to live." Jason's mind, now fully integrated with his Kale memories, rapidly calculated possibilities. Standard Syndicate attack formations. Weak points in their perimeter. The exact capabilities of the weapon in his hands. "Get ready," he whispered to Valia. "When I move, head directly for the scout ship. Don't stop for anything." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "Something unexpected." He pressed a brief, fierce kiss to her lips, then touched his daughter's cheek one last time. "I love you both." Before Valia could respond, Jason burst through the ruined doorway, firing the energy weapon in a precise pattern not at the Syndicate forces, but at the ground before them. The specialized ionic charges reacted with the Earth, creating a massive dust cloud that engulfed the entire front line. In the confusion, Jason charged directly at Draylock, moving with the enhanced speed and precision of his fully restored combat training. The commander raised his weapon, but Jason was already sliding beneath its aim, firing upward to disable Draylock's neural control helmet. "Now," he shouted to Valia, who emerged from the house, the exoskeleton support allowing her to move with surprising speed despite her post-birth condition. She clutched Lyra tightly against her chest as she ran toward the scout ship at the edge of the property. Syndicate operatives, recovering from the initial confusion, turned to intercept her. Jason anticipated this, systematically targeting their mobility systems with precisely aimed shots. One by one, they stumbled and fell, unable to pursue. Draylock, momentarily stunned by the loss of his neural controls, recovered with surprising speed. He discarded his disabled helmet and drew a secondary weapon, a vibrating blade that hummed with deadly energy. "You've improved your combat skills since Lyria," the commander observed, circling Jason warily. "But you're still a scientist playing at being a warrior." "And you're still underestimating me," Jason replied, dodging Draylock's first strike with a fluid movement that would have been impossible before his memories integrated. Their battle became a deadly dance, Draylock's superior strength against Jason's unexpected agility. Each time the commander's blade came close, Jason countered with techniques drawn from his resistance training, enhanced by his human body's natural athleticism. From the corner of his eye, he saw Valia reach the scout ship, her hands working quickly over the external access panel. The ship's entry ramp began to lower, offering escape. The momentary distraction cost him. Draylock's blade sliced across his arm, cutting deep. Pain flared, but Jason used the commander's forward momentum against him, pivoting to slam his elbow into Draylock's exposed throat. The commander staggered backward, giving Jason the opening he needed. He fired the energy weapon point-blank at Draylock's chest plate. The armor absorbed much of the blast but still buckled inward, sending the commander crashing to the ground. "Jason!" Valia called from the ship's ramp. "Hurry!" He turned to run toward her, but his injured arm slowed him. The remaining Syndicate operatives were regrouping, weapons targeting his back. "Go!" he shouted to Valia. "Take off now." Her face showed anguish, but she understood the tactical necessity. The ship's engines hummed to life as she disappeared inside with their daughter. Jason continued running, energy blasts scorching the ground around him. The ship began to rise, its ramp still extended. With his last surge of strength, he leaped, fingers grasping the edge of the ramp. For one terrible moment, he hung suspended, his wounded arm threatening to give way. Then Valia was there, her hands grasping his, pulling him aboard as the ship accelerated skyward. The ramp sealed behind him as he collapsed onto the deck, breathing heavily. "You made it," Valia whispered, cradling his face in her hands. Beside her, Lyra lay securely fastened in a makeshift carrier, her extraordinary eyes watching them with that impossible awareness. "Did you doubt I would?" Jason asked, managing a smile despite his exhaustion. "Never," Valia replied, helping him to the pilot's seat. "Not since the moment I found you again." As Jason's hands moved over the controls, familiar despite never having piloted such a craft in his human form, he gazed out at the Earth growing smaller beneath them. The home he had known as Jason Mercer was now just a smoking ruin, that life forever altered. "Will you miss it?" Valia asked softly, sensing his thoughts. "Parts of it," he admitted. "But I've remembered who I truly am." He looked at her, then at their daughter whose existence had catalyzed this extraordinary reunion across the stars. "And I've remembered where I belong." The ship accelerated into the upper atmosphere, Earth's blue giving way to the darkness of space. In 7 hours, they would rendezvous with the Resistance extraction team. Beyond that lay uncertainty, the continued fight against the Syndicate, the challenge of protecting Lyra and her unique abilities, the adjustment to his fully integrated dual identity. But as Valia settled beside him, their daughter secure between them, Jason felt a profound sense of rightness. The man who had once been only Jason Mercer, Earth physics teacher, now embraced the truth of his existence. He was Kale of Lyria, Resistance commander and quantum physicist. He was a husband who had found his way back to his beloved across impossible distances. He was a father with a daughter whose potential could change the course of multiple worlds. And whatever came next, they would face it together, a family reunited by a love that had transcended time, space, and even death itself. As the stars welcomed them home, Lyra reached out her tiny hand, her touch connecting with both her parents. In that moment of contact, a gentle pulse of energy rippled outward, a quantum resonance that seemed to bind their 3 souls together. It was both an ending and a beginning, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another in a story written across the cosmos. "Where to now?" Valia asked, her fingers entwining with his over the navigation controls. Jason smiled, the integrated memories of both his lives giving him a perspective few beings would ever know. "Home," he said simply. "Wherever that may be, as long as we're together." The ship accelerated to light speed, 3 hearts bound by love, genetics, and quantum destiny, heading toward a future limited only by the vastness of stars themselves.